Out of the storm came a rider, hunched low in the saddle, a gray horse laboring against the weight of the wind. Its hooves sank deep, each step an act of stubborn faith. The rider wore a heavy wool coat patched at the elbows, a battered hat pulled low, and a scarf wrapped up to her eyes. She rode without hurry, without fear, as if the cold had long ago ceased to matter. Esther Bell had come 1,000 miles west with a heart stitched together from old grief and new hope. In the pocket of her coat rested a letter, worn soft by reading, promising a home, a man, and the final chance to not grow old alone. She had no illusions. She was 55, lined by time and weather, carrying the kind of strength the young mistook for frailty. Her hands were calloused and sure. Her back was still straight, though her heart, perhaps, leaned just a little. The town barely stirred as she passed through. A dog barked once before disappearing into a doorway. A single lantern swung over the entrance to the saloon, casting a trembling circle of gold onto the snow. Esther found the general store where her promised groom was said to work, Henry Tate, proprietor and bachelor by necessity more than choice. She tied her horse to the rail and stepped inside, stomping snow from her boots. The warmth inside was thin, the kind of heat that never quite reached the bones. A stove clattered in the corner, its iron sides glinting dull red. Behind the counter, Henry looked up. He was a thin man with a hooked nose and a permanent frown, sorting nails into small wooden boxes. His eyes slid over her, head to boots, and something in his mouth twisted. "You're Esther Bell," he said, as if doubting his own tongue. She unwrapped her scarf and nodded, a small, steady gesture. He barked a short laugh, mean and cold. "Thought you'd be younger." The words hit her like sleet against bare skin. She did not flinch. She had been called worse by softer mouths. Henry wiped his hands on a rag, as though brushing her away like dust. "Ain't no need. Got no place for another mouth. Thought I was getting a girl, not a grandmother." Esther tucked the letter back into her coat without speaking. Pride was a brittle thing in winter. Better to save what was left of it for shelter later. The door clattered behind her as she left. Snow stung her cheeks, the town receding into a blur of dim shapes and colder silences. No room at the inn either, when she asked. A young woman with yellow curls said sweetly they had no spare rooms, then turned away, laughter curling under her breath like smoke. At the saloon, the barkeep only shook his head. No place for decent women. No charity for strangers. By sundown, the town was shutting its doors against the storm, and Esther found herself standing in the empty street, her horse shivering, her own body growing heavier with the slow creep of exhaustion. She thought of pitching a lean-to against the livery stable, but the idea of freezing alone in the snow wore against her more than the idea of a cold, rough floor. The stable was warm with the breath of animals and the sweet, musty smell of hay. She found a corner, tucked her bedroll around her shoulders, and sat quietly, the darkness settling thick and sure. It was not a home, but it would hold her body through the night. Whether it could hold her spirit was another matter. The sound came just before full dark, a muffled thud, the soft grunt of something heavy falling into snow. Esther rose, ears sharp. She moved to the stable doors and peered out. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling dance of snowflakes under the brittle light of the saloon lantern. Then there, a shape crumpled beside the watering trough, dark against the blinding white. Her boots sank deep as she crossed the street, her breath burning in her lungs. Closer, she saw it was a man, his hat lost somewhere in the snow, his hair matted with ice. His coat was open, his shirt soaked through. He was murmuring something, or maybe only shivering too hard to be still. Esther knelt. His skin was blue at the lips. She pressed her hand to his cheek. Cold, but not yet the terrible stillness that meant death had found him. "Come on now," she whispered, more prayer than command. It took all her strength to haul him upright, his weight sagging against her like a fallen tree. Inch by inch, she dragged him back across the street, into the stable, into the fragile warmth she had claimed for herself. The horses stirred, nickering softly, their warm breath blooming in the cold air. Esther laid him on her bedroll, pulled his frozen coat from his body, stripped off his sodden boots. She wrapped him in blankets, tucked the saddle blankets over for extra weight, and set to work rubbing his limbs, coaxing blood back into stubborn flesh. Hours passed, or maybe only moments. Time was strange in the dark. His face was lean, hollowed by hard living, but young still, no more than 35, she guessed. He had the rough hands of a working man, the scarred knuckles of someone who fought for what little he had. When at last he stirred, coughing weakly, she gave him a sip of water and murmured small, nonsense comforts. "Hush now. Easy. You're safe." He tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. Esther laid a hand against his brow, smoothing the hair away from his face. "Rest," she said. "There's time enough for words when the storm lifts." He slept fitfully, fevered and restless, and she stayed beside him, the fire of her own body lending what small warmth she could spare. Outside, the snow kept falling, an endless hush, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Morning broke gray and brittle. The town was slow to wake, doors creaking open to glimpse the storm's aftermath. When the stable doors swung wide, it was not kindness that came in but suspicion. Men gathered, their faces red from the cold, eyes sharp with judgment. They found her there, a woman too old for innocence, too proud for excuses, and the widower Caleb Hargrove, half naked beneath the piled blankets, his breath rattling but sure. It did not take much for tongues to wag. By noon, the story had twisted itself into a shameful thing, an old woman trapping a man in a scandal, a charity gone too far, a ruin of good order. Esther met their stares with a stillness carved from years of being unseen, unwanted. She rose slowly, gathering her things, preparing to leave as quietly as she had come. But the town was not content to let her slip away. Pastor Mullins, tall and grim, called a meeting in the church. The pews filled with curious faces, some smug, some uneasy. The decision was made swift and final. Marriage. Respectability demanded it. The town could not abide the stain. Caleb, barely able to stand, was given no choice. Esther offered no voice. A paper ring. A name written into the ledger. A life knotted to another's not by love but by necessity. That night, Esther lay awake in the corner of Caleb's collapsing house, the wind scratching at the walls, the roof weeping melted snow through its broken seams. She listened to his breathing, shallow but steady, and let her own heart be still. She had crossed 1,000 miles of hope and winter to find herself here, in a stranger's storm-tossed home, with nothing but the steady beating of her own blood to remind her she was alive. Outside, the storm was breaking, the wind easing into softer sighs. Inside, a different storm was just beginning to stir. And somewhere deep inside her, like a hidden seed under snow, something small and stubborn began to unfurl. Hope, maybe. Or something wilder. Something meant to survive. The house clung stubbornly to the side of a hill, its timbers sagging under the weight of too many hard seasons. Snow shrouded the sagging roof and pressed against the broken window panes like a patient siege. Inside, the cold seeped through every crack, curling around Esther's ankles and frosting her breath into small, desperate clouds. She built a fire with kindling pulled from a splintered chair, the flames licking greedily at the dry wood. The room came alive in fits and starts, light catching on battered furniture, dust motes swirling in the sharp air. Caleb lay on the narrow bed pushed up against the wall, his body still shivering in the aftermath of the fever. His face was hollow, a man carved down to his final defenses, and yet there was a stubbornness in him too, a refusal to be carried wholly into death. Esther moved with quiet certainty, tucking a quilt up to his chin, stirring a pot of weak broth over the fire. Her hands were steady, though inside her, a weariness gnawed at the edges of her strength. This was not the ending she had envisioned when she answered the letter months ago. Not a husband waiting at a warm hearth, but a wounded stranger and a house barely holding against the wind. Outside, the world remained a blur of white and gray. Inside, time slowed to the beating of two hearts, one mending, one refusing to break. By the third day, Caleb could sit up, though the effort left him pale and trembling. He said little, his eyes flickering over her with something like shame, something like suspicion. He moved as if expecting her to demand something from him at any moment. But Esther asked for nothing. She fixed the broken hinge on the door. She cleaned the soot from the hearth. She patched the holes in the roof as best she could, her stitches neat and sure. The town kept its distance, but its judgment clung to them like smoke. Once, a boy came by with a basket of bruised apples and left it on the porch without a word. Another time, Esther saw the widow Lillian passing by, her mouth pinched tight, her shawl drawn up high against the sight of scandal. Caleb watched too, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists he did not raise. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the light grew long and gold against the walls, he spoke for the first time since the fever broke. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice rough as gravel. Esther looked up from her mending, thread slipping through her fingers like water. "I know," she said simply. He frowned, as if confused by her lack of anger, her lack of demands. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, staring into the fire. "No more than I did," Esther replied, her voice as soft and steady as falling snow. The silence between them stretched, heavy but not cruel. He rubbed a hand over his face, the beginnings of a beard rasping against his palm. "I ain't got much to offer." Esther tied off her thread and set the mending aside. She moved to the fire, stirring the coals, coaxing up a brighter flame. "Warmth," she said, almost to herself. "Shelter. A place to set down burdens too heavy to carry alone." Caleb said nothing, but the lines of his shoulders eased, just a fraction. In the days that followed, a quiet rhythm emerged. Esther rose early, gathering what supplies she could salvage from the barn: rusted tools, broken harnesses, a sack of oats nibbled thin by mice. She mended what could be saved and stored away what could not. Caleb, still weak but growing stronger, began to join her. At first, in small things, hauling firewood, mending a fence rail, sharpening the kitchen knives. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if relearning the weight of the world in his hands. They spoke little, but their silences became companionable, threaded with the simple language of work and breath and shared survival. One afternoon, while clearing the snow from the front step, Caleb paused, leaning heavily on the shovel. His gaze swept over the frozen yard, the barren trees, the heavy sky. "This place," he said, his voice low. "It wasn't always like this." Esther straightened, brushing snow from her skirt. "What was it like?" she asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Laughter. Children. Horses running wild over the hills. My wife. She had a way of making everything seem alive." His face twisted briefly, the memory cutting deep. Esther said nothing. Some wounds needed room to breathe. Caleb set his jaw, as if sealing the grief back inside. He went back to work, and Esther joined him, their shadows long and thin across the snow. Later, inside, she found an old cracked fiddle tucked away behind the stove. Its strings were loose, the wood scarred, but it still held the memory of music. She set it gently on the table, and when Caleb came in, he stared at it as if she had placed a ghost before him. "My wife used to play," he said, almost inaudible. Esther nodded, her hands folded quietly in her lap. He sat down heavily, staring at the fiddle, his breath misting in the cold room. "You ever play?" he asked suddenly. "A little," she admitted. "Long ago." He pushed it toward her, the movement abrupt, almost clumsy. Esther took it up, tuning by ear, fingers moving with the muscle memory of another life. She drew the bow across the strings, coaxing out a thin, wavering note that wove through the room like smoke. She played a simple tune, something slow and mournful, the notes trembling but true. It was not skill that filled the room, but heart, a raw, aching tenderness that wrapped around the broken walls and broken man and stitched them both up, just a little. When she finished, the fire had burned down to soft embers. Caleb's head was bowed, his hands loose on his knees. He did not speak, and she did not press him. In that silence, something fragile took root between them. Not love, not yet, but a kinship forged in the quiet places where words were too heavy to lift. The next morning, Caleb fixed the broken hinge on the stable door without being asked. The morning after that, he came in from feeding the animals with a small, crooked smile and a handful of wild greens he had found poking stubbornly through the snow. For the first time, Esther laughed, a soft, surprised sound that seemed to warm even the coldest corners of the house. Outside, the wind still howled, and the snow still fell, but inside, something had shifted, delicate as the first thaw. One evening, as the storm raged again, they sat together by the hearth, sharing a supper of thin stew and hard bread. Caleb cleared his throat, fidgeting with his spoon. "I'm sorry," he said, the words rough-edged and awkward. Esther looked up, patient, waiting. "For what they said," he continued, staring into the fire. "For what they made you do." She set her spoon down, the simple act full of grace. "They didn't make me do anything," she said. "I chose to stay." He looked at her then, really looked, and in his eyes there was a flicker of something unspoken. Gratitude, maybe. Or awe. Or the first faint glimmerings of trust. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks up the chimney. The shadows danced across the walls, shifting and alive. For the first time since she had stepped off the train and into the storm, Esther allowed herself to believe that perhaps this winter would not be the end of her story after all. Perhaps it was only the beginning. The snow eased by morning, the sky thinning to a pale, bruised blue. The town stirred reluctantly, smoke rising from chimneys, tracks stamped fresh into the streets. Caleb and Esther stood side by side on the porch, mugs of weak coffee warming their hands. They said nothing, but the silence between them was easy now, filled with a small, stubborn hope that had begun to take root in the ashes of all they had lost. The wind carried the faint scent of thaw, and somewhere, deep beneath the frozen ground, life stirred. Waiting. The town church stood crooked against the winter sky, its steeple tilting slightly as if bowing to the endless snow. Inside, the air was sharp with cold and the sour tang of damp wood. A handful of townsfolk gathered, their breath misting in the icy gloom, their faces half hidden by scarves and shadowed intent. Pastor Mullins cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the silence. Before him stood Caleb Hargrove, pale but upright, and Esther Bell, her chin lifted, her hands steady even as the weight of 100 watching eyes pressed down on her like a stone. The ceremony was brief, words falling into the hush like pebbles into a frozen well. Mullins spoke of duty, of decency, of the binding of lives in the eyes of God and man. There was no talk of love, no soaring promises, only the scratching of a pen against paper and the thud of heavy boots against wooden floors. Caleb slipped a ring onto Esther's finger, a thin band of twisted wire hammered flat, forged not from affection, but necessity. It pinched slightly, a small reminder that even the bonds meant to protect could chafe. When it was done, the townsfolk dispersed with muttered congratulations, eager to return to their stoves and their safe, warm homes. No feast followed, no laughter, no dancing. Only the soughing of the wind through the bare branches and the distant, restless murmur of the river beneath its frozen skin. Caleb did not offer his arm. Esther did not expect it. They walked side by side through the whitening streets, the snow beginning again, gentle now, like ashes drifting from some unseen fire. The ranch seemed smaller than ever as they approached, half sunk into the land, a place built for survival more than comfort. Esther paused at the threshold, feeling the weight of the paper ring on her finger, the cold kiss of the doorknob beneath her palm. Inside, Caleb shrugged off his coat, his movements stiff and awkward. He set about building the fire without a word, the scrape of wood against hearthstone filling the space where conversation might have lived. Esther followed, unwrapping her shawl, hanging it carefully by the door. She moved through the familiar rooms, kitchen, parlor, the narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, taking the measure of her new life. There was no ceremony here either. No bed of flowers, no sweet whispers. Only 2 people stitched together by the brittle threads of survival, trying to make something whole from the scraps left behind. Caleb set 2 bowls of stew on the table, the gesture practical, almost apologetic. Esther sat opposite him, folding her hands for a moment in silent grace before lifting her spoon. They ate without speaking, the fire crackling in the hearth, the snow tapping softly at the windows like a patient hand. Later, Caleb retreated to his room, the door left open just a crack. Esther took the smaller room, grateful for the space to breathe, to gather herself in the thin light of a kerosene lamp. She set her few belongings on the dresser, a worn Bible, a locket with no picture inside, a hairbrush missing half its bristles. Ghosts of another life, another woman, another chance. The first night passed without ceremony too. The house sighed and groaned around them, the winter pressing in, the hearth struggling to keep the darkness at bay. Morning brought little change. Caleb rose early, moving through chores with a grim efficiency. Esther followed, her hands steady even as her heart faltered. She mended the torn curtains with thread unraveled from an old dress. She swept the floors, drove out the lingering smell of mildew with pine boughs burned in the stove. She baked a loaf of bread so thin and hard it could barely be called such, but Caleb ate it without complaint. Day by day, the house began to breathe again, to stretch and settle into something resembling a home. Esther planted small kindnesses like seeds. A pot of stew left simmering on the stove, a blanket stitched with careful hands draped over the back of Caleb's chair, a candle lit in the window when he returned from the fields at dusk. At first, Caleb seemed blind to these offerings, his face set in lines of weariness and grief. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the lines began to soften. One evening, after a long day repairing the chicken coop half collapsed under the snow, Caleb came inside and found Esther dozing by the fire, her mending fallen from her lap. He paused, something tender flickering in his gaze before he set down the bundle of firewood more quietly than usual, careful not to wake her. Another night, he brought her a handful of wild berries, half frozen but sweet, cupped awkwardly in his calloused hands. Esther accepted them with a soft smile, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. A spark passed between them, fragile and tentative, like the first shy shoot of spring pushing through frozen ground. Still, the ghosts lingered. Caleb sometimes disappeared for hours, walking the hills alone, returning with snow on his shoulders and sorrow in his eyes. Esther did not question him. She knew that grief was not a thing that could be hurried or reasoned with. Instead, she tended the hearth, keeping the flame alive against the long, bitter nights. One afternoon, while mending a fence post, Caleb spoke without looking at her. "My wife's name was Anna." Esther straightened slowly, the hammer resting against her hip. "She was sunshine," he said, the word breaking on his tongue. "Could make the coldest morning feel like May." Esther said nothing, only waited, her stillness an invitation. "She gave me a son," Caleb continued, his voice hollow. "Little Jamie. He didn't last the winter." The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. Esther crossed the yard and laid a hand gently on his arm. He flinched, then stilled, the warmth of her touch sinking through the cold armor he wore. "I'm not here to replace them," she said, her voice low and steady. "I'm just here to help carry what you can't bear alone." Caleb's shoulders sagged, the weight of sorrow bending him. For a long moment, he leaned into her hand, allowing the comfort to seep into old wounds. The paper ring on her finger caught the last light of day, a small glint of gold in the gathering dusk. That night, as the storm howled around the house and the fire blazed low, Caleb set 2 mugs of coffee on the table and sat across from her. He cleared his throat, staring into the dark brew as if seeking answers at the bottom of the cup. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. Esther wrapped her hands around her mug, savoring its thin warmth. "Neither do I," she said with a small smile. "But perhaps we could learn together." He looked up then, really looked, and something in his gaze shifted. Not love, not yet, but a recognition, a respect, a quiet beginning. They sipped their coffee in silence, the snow piling against the windows, the wind singing its lonely song through the eaves. The hearth crackled and spit, sending sparks twisting up the chimney like prayers. Esther leaned back in her chair, her body weary but her heart strangely light. For the first time in a long while, she felt not adrift, but anchored, not by duty or pity, but by the slow, steady weaving of 2 broken lives into something strong enough to weather the storm. Outside, the world slept beneath its shroud of snow. Inside, a new fire smoldered in the ashes of what had been lost. It was not love yet, but it was something. And sometimes, something was enough to begin. The sky bruised over the hills, a deep, sullen purple that pressed low against the earth. The air grew heavy, thick with the kind of cold that crept under clothes and into bones. Birds fled hours before the first crack of thunder rumbled across the plains, low and long like the growl of something ancient waking from its sleep. Caleb stood in the yard, his hands fists at his sides, watching the horizon darken. The cattle bunched against the fences, uneasy, their breath white and fast in the dying light. Snow began to fall again, not the soft drifting kind, but sharp, slanted needles driven by a wind that screamed across the empty fields. Esther came to the door, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, the hem fluttering like a wounded wing in the gusts. "It's coming fast," she said, voice raised above the rising roar. Caleb nodded but made no move to come inside. His body was taut as a bowstring, every muscle straining toward the storm as if daring it to break him. "We need to bring the cattle into the lower pasture," he said, voice rough. "If they stay up here, we'll lose them." She stepped into the snow without hesitation, boots sinking deep, skirts snapping around her legs. Together, they moved through the growing blizzard, driving the cattle toward the shelter of the hollow below the ridge. The animals fought them at every step, spooked and stubborn, their hooves churning up the frozen ground. The wind howled louder, tearing at their clothes, blinding them with stinging snow. Caleb's shouted commands were ripped from his mouth before they reached Esther's ears, but she understood the urgency, the grim determination in his eyes. By the time the last of the cattle stumbled into the hollow, night had fallen, thick and absolute. They stumbled back toward the house, leaning into the wind, each step a battle. Inside, the fire had guttered low. Esther fell to her knees before it, feeding it with trembling hands, coaxing the flames back to life. Caleb slammed the door against the storm, bolting it with a fierce finality. For a long while, they said nothing, only sat near the hearth, shivering and spent, listening to the blizzard beat its fists against the walls. Then Caleb rose, pacing the small room like a caged animal, his shoulders rigid, his mouth a hard line. "This place is cursed," he muttered. "Everything I touch rots. Everything I love dies." Esther watched him quietly, hands folded in her lap. He turned on her, anger flashing in his eyes. "You should have gone when you had the chance. Should have left me to the crows." The words hit harder than the wind, but Esther held her ground. She had weathered storms harsher than Caleb Hargrove's grief. "I came here for my own reasons," she said evenly. "You didn't ask me. I chose." "Chose?" He barked a bitter laugh. "You were forced. Shamed into it by a pack of fools." She shook her head slowly. "I stayed because I saw something worth saving." He froze, chest heaving, snow melting and running down his cheeks like tears he would never claim. "There's nothing left of me," he said hoarsely. "Just broken pieces." "Then let's pick them up," she said softly. "Piece by piece. Together." For a heartbeat, he stood there, torn between fury and something more dangerous, hope. Then he turned away, hands raking through his hair. "You deserve better." "I deserve a choice," she said, rising to her feet, her voice low but sure. "And I chose this. Chose you." The wind screamed against the house, rattling the windows like 1,000 desperate hands. A loud crack split the night, the sound of something giving way. Caleb's head snapped up, and without a word, he grabbed his coat. Esther followed without hesitation. Outside, the barn roof had partially collapsed under the weight of the snow. A calf, no more than a few hours old, bleated weakly from the wreckage, trapped beneath a tangle of broken beams and wet hay. Caleb waded into the wreckage, tossing aside debris with reckless strength. Esther grabbed a fallen board, leveraging it up, her boots slipping in the icy muck. Together, they freed the calf, Caleb cradling the small, shivering body against his chest as they staggered back toward the house. Inside, Esther built up the fire, wrapping the calf in every spare blanket they had. Caleb knelt beside it, rubbing its legs, murmuring soft, broken things under his breath. Hours passed. The calf's breathing steadied. Its eyes opened, dark and uncertain, but alive. Caleb sat back on his heels, his face wet with sweat and something else. "You saved it," he said, voice thick. "We saved it," Esther corrected gently. He looked at her then, really looked, and something inside him seemed to splinter and heal all at once. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "Don't deserve you." Esther reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead, the gesture tender, timeless. "No one earns grace," she said. "It's given. Freely." The words hung between them, fragile and powerful. Caleb bowed his head, overcome. When he spoke again, it was barely a whisper. "I'm scared." "So am I," she said. He looked up, a raw, naked hope flickering in his eyes. But we're still here, she continued. Still standing. That counts for something. The calf whimpered softly, nosing against Caleb's hand. He smiled, a small, broken, beautiful thing, and stroked its damp fur. The storm raged on, but inside the house there was a different kind of warmth. Fragile, stubborn, born not of ease but of endurance. Later, as the fire burned low and the calf slept curled between them, Caleb spoke into the darkness. I don't know how to love again, he said. Not yet. Esther's hand found his in the dark, their fingers twining slowly, shyly. Then let's just learn how to live again, she said. One day at a time. He squeezed her hand, his calluses rough against her skin, his grip trembling but sure. Outside, the storm began to break, the wind dying down to low, exhausted moans. The first faint hint of dawn seeped into the eastern sky, a bruised and tender light. They sat together, hand in hand, while the world remade itself around them. Not lovers yet. Not strangers anymore. Something in between, something waiting, patient and sure, like seeds sleeping beneath the snow, dreaming of spring. Caleb leaned his head against Esther's shoulder, his body heavy with spent grief, spent rage. She rested her cheek against his hair, closing her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she slept without fear. The snow dripped from the eaves in slow, steady rhythms, the land exhaling, the house settling deeper into the earth. Morning found them still there, still together, stitched into the new day by nothing more than shared breath and shared hope. And sometimes that was enough. The fire is steady now. Let's walk into spring together. The thaw came slowly at first, tentative and shy, as if afraid the cold might rear back in anger. Thin rivulets of water carved paths through the snowdrifts, and the earth, long buried under its heavy white shroud, began to breathe again. Brown grass appeared in ragged patches, brittle but alive. Overhead, the sky softened from iron gray to a wide, aching blue. Esther stood on the porch, Caleb's old coat draped around her shoulders, watching as the first crocuses pushed their violet heads through the slush. The mountains in the distance shrugged off their snowy mantles, and the river, once locked silent under ice, murmured once more, a song both sorrowful and sweet. Inside the house, the calf, now lively and curious, butted against the walls, sniffing at the hearth where Esther had laid down a fresh braided rug stitched from scraps. Its coat was rough, its movements awkward, but it was alive, stubbornly, miraculously alive, and in that small defiance, Esther found a mirror of herself. Caleb came around the side of the house, his boots squelching in the muddy yard. He carried a rough-hewn cradle he had spent the last week building, sanding it by hand until the wood gleamed like honey. It wasn't meant for a child. There were no babies coming to this house, no cries in the night. This cradle was for the orphaned lambs, the abandoned kits, the fragile things that otherwise would have no place in the world. He set it down on the porch beside her, his cheeks flushed from the work, his hair curling damply at his brow. I thought it might be needed, he said, his voice gruff but his eyes soft. Esther ran her hand over the cradle's smooth curve, feeling the strength in it, the patience. A man's redemption carved into oak and pine. It's beautiful, she said. He shrugged, awkward under the praise, but the corner of his mouth tugged into the ghost of a smile. Spring crept in under the doors and through the cracks, coaxing life back into the battered house. Esther opened windows wide to let the clean air swirl through the rooms, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and wild sage. She planted seeds in old cracked pots along the sill, herbs for cooking, bright marigolds to catch the sunlight. Caleb worked the fields, his steps growing steadier, his movements less burdened by invisible chains. Sometimes he sang under his breath, low and tuneless, but it was a song nonetheless, and it made Esther's heart ache in the best kind of way. They moved around each other with a growing ease, a dance of shared labor and wordless understanding. He fixed the roof with her beside him, hammering shingles into place as she handed up nails. She mended his shirts by firelight, her stitches neat and sure, her touch lingering just a little longer each evening. At night, they sat by the hearth, not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence. The calf sprawled between them, dreaming twitchily of running across green fields not yet born. There were still hard days. Days when Caleb's eyes went dark with memories, when he walked out into the hills and didn't return until the stars were out. Days when Esther woke from dreams of cold trains and cruel voices, her chest tight with old hurts. But they faced them together now, not as strangers, not as survivors clinging to different wreckage, but as something more. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Caleb returned from town with something bundled carefully in his arms. Esther met him at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. He held out a small bundle wrapped in blue ticking cloth. "For you," he said simply. She unwrapped it slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside was a book of poems, the leather worn soft, the pages delicate as moth wings. Inside the front cover, written in a careful, clumsy hand, was her name. "I thought," he said, faltering, "maybe you could read them to me. Sometimes." Esther traced her name on the page, her throat tightening. She looked up and saw not the broken man who had collapsed into her life months ago, but a man standing on the fragile, beautiful edge of beginning again. "I would like that very much," she said. They sat together on the porch steps, the book open between them, the twilight folding itself gently around their shoulders. Esther read aloud, her voice weaving words into the cooling air, stories of love and loss, of rivers that remembered and fields that forgave. Caleb listened with his eyes closed, a faint smile playing on his lips. When she finished, he opened his eyes and turned to her, something raw and shining in his gaze. "I ain't good with words," he said. "Never have been. But I know what I feel." She waited, heart pounding quietly against her ribs. "I was dying," he said simply. "Long before the snow. Long before you." He took her hand in his, cradling it between his rough palms. "You brought me back." Tears blurred the world into gold and shadow, but Esther did not look away. "You saved me too," she whispered. He bent his head, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, reverent and sure. The paper ring still circled her finger, thin but unbroken, a reminder of the storm they had survived, the promises forged in necessity now tempered into something stronger than mere duty. "I don't want you here because you have to be," he said, voice shaking. "I want you here because you choose it. Choose me." Esther cupped his cheek, feeling the scratch of new stubble, the warmth of life beneath his skin. "I chose you the day I dragged you out of the snow," she said. "I chose you every day after." He kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and river water and second chances. A kiss that sealed no bargains, demanded no promises, only offered a future, one fragile heartbeat at a time. When they broke apart, the stars had begun to prick the sky, cold and bright and endless. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "We'll make it," he said. "Somehow." "We already have," she answered. Spring unfurled around them, slow and certain. The river laughed as it tumbled over stones. The grass grew tall and green, waving in the warm breezes. Wildflowers stitched themselves across the hills in bright, defiant colors. The town watched from a distance, their judgments softening into curiosity, then into something quieter, almost like respect. Some sent small offerings, a basket of eggs, a bolt of calico, a pie left cooling on the porch without a name attached. Esther accepted each with quiet grace, understanding that forgiveness, like spring, could not be forced, only waited for. One morning, as Caleb mended the fence and Esther hung laundry in the warming sun, a wagon rumbled down the road and stopped at the gate. A young woman stepped down, her belly round with child, her eyes shadowed with fear. "Begging your pardon," she said, twisting her hands. "I heard. You might take in strays." Esther met Caleb's gaze across the yard, a smile curling at the edges of her mouth. "We do," she said. "We surely do." They took the girl in, made up a bed for her, shared what little they had. And in doing so, they planted deeper roots into the rocky soil of their lives, roots that would hold against storms yet to come. The cradle found a purpose after all, rocking gently in the parlor with its small, precious burdens. Esther read from her book of poems every night, her voice a steady river through the house. Caleb sat near her, carving toys from scraps of wood, the shavings curling at his feet like the petals of some forgotten flower. Their love was not a wildfire. It was a slow-growing thing, a field turned green again after a long winter, a river finding its way back to the sea. They built a life not on what they had lost, but on what they still carried: resilience, kindness, a quiet, stubborn hope. And sometimes, on the clearest mornings, Esther would stand on the porch and look out over the fields and the river, the town beyond, and she would press a hand to her chest, feeling the steady drum of her heart. She had not been too old for love. She had not been too late for a beginning. She had simply needed a winter fierce enough to strip her bare, a storm strong enough to break her free, and a man wounded enough to recognize the rare, stubborn beauty in a woman who chose to stay. As the sun rose higher, casting long, golden beams across the land, Esther turned back toward the house where laughter now lived, where life had found a way to bloom. Sometimes, the finest springs came after the cruelest winters. Sometimes, the broken things built the strongest homes. Sometimes, the ones the world overlooked ended up saving it, one small act of stubborn grace at a time. And so they lived, not perfectly, not easily, but truly. And that, perhaps, was the greatest triumph of all. If this story stirred something in your heart, traveler, don't leave without a trace. Tell me where you're watching from, share your own stories of hope, and subscribe for more Wild West tales of second chances and wild, stubborn love. Until next time, may your fires burn steady, and your winters always find their spring.